Okay, so welcome to everyone joining us today for our best practice and education rounds. These rounds are jointly offered by the Center for Faculty Development and the Wilson Center. Please note that this session will be archived on the CFD website. And if you wish to see a live transcript of today's session, please turn on your closed captioning at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So I would like to begin with an acknowledgement of the land on which we work, study, and live. And before I read it, I just want to take a moment to situate yourself, feel the ground under your feet, and take a deep breath with me. We recognize that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which the Center for Faculty Development and the Wilson Center are located that precede the establishment of the University of Toronto, Unity Health Toronto, and University Health Network. We acknowledge our presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. Today, this land is home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. And we are grateful to have the opportunity to live, work, and gather on these territories. We acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13, signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaty, signed with multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. Since these rounds are a virtual gathering, a singular land acknowledgement does not capture the richness of our distribution across many locations. I encourage you to consider your own position with regard to the land where you find yourself. And if you're not sure how to locate the Indigenous territories, treaties, and languages that shape both the past and present of your current location, I invite you to take a moment now to look it up. Open up in another browser window, type in nativeland.ca. It is a crowdsourced interactive map built around principles of land as pedagogy. The intention is to use these resources as an opportunity to critically engage in discussions about colonization, land rights, language, and Indigenous history. Land acknowledgements are only a starting point for larger conversations. More concrete acts of restitution and transformation are needed to address underlying inequities and blatant discrimination in the distribution of resources between Canada's First Peoples and settlers. So I'd like to introduce our moderator for today, Joanne Goldman. Joanne is a scientist at the Center for Quality Improvement and Patient Safety. Her research focuses on the use of sociologically informed theoretical and methodological perspectives to study quality improvement and patient safety education and practices, as well as interprofessional education and care. So welcome, Joanne.
Thank you, Lindsay. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to start with a few housekeeping details before we begin. If you have a question, please use the Q&A box. I will be monitoring throughout the session, and I'll give our presenter, Stella, an opportunity to answer at the end. Please also ensure that you fill out the short evaluation that will be sent to your email at the end of this round. Your feedback is important to the ongoing improvement of the BEPR rounds. I will now introduce our speaker for today's session, Stella Ng. Stella is the Director of Research at the Center for Faculty Development and holds the Arel Family Chair in Health Professions Teaching. She is also an education scientist at the Center for Interprofessional Education. She's a program developer for the CFD Summer Education Institute, the education research community, and the online supplements for education. She became a registered audiologist in 2006, and while practicing, earned her PhD in health professional education. Stella was motivated by her clinical experiences to study how health professionals learn to practice well in response to value-conflicted, uncertain, and unstable zones of practice. Stella's extensive program of research advances interdisciplinary theories of reflective practice and critical reflection. Informed by this research, Stella studies and advances critical pedagogy and knowledge mobilization approaches to support the development of compassionate, ethical, and reflective practitioners. Welcome, Stella.
Thank you, Joanne, and thank you, everyone. It's lovely to see you all, even just by name, here today. So the theme of this year's BEPR is uncertainty. And unprecedented uncertainty is a really common descriptor in this past year. But while this exact situation, the pandemic, may be new, uncertainty itself is not. In fact, attempts to understand, tolerate, and manage uncertainty have been topics of health professions education since the birth of the field. Uncertainty is actually a defining feature of what makes a professional. Being able to manage uncertainty well is what makes us the professional practitioners that we are. All clinicians or professionals are domain experts in some area. So for example, a speech language pathologist may have specific scientific domain expertise in speech and language development or swallowing disorders. Donald Shinn would call these areas of practice and this aspect of practice technical rationality. But clinicians must also be well-versed in social relations and systems-based practice, working in relation to other people within and across multiple complex systems, collaborating, communicating, advocating, integrating science-informed practice into deeply personal and complex social contexts means that uncertainty is the norm. Practicing in these areas is what Shinn called professional artistry. When clinicians struggle to notice or respond to uncertainty well, there are consequences. So past research has shown that these consequences can include ineffective communication, inefficient service provision, conflict for patients instead of care, and burden placed upon patients, as well as inequity, where not all patients are able to access and experience the same level or quality of care. So today, framing that problem as that, I'm going to focus on two layers and this sort of false dilemma or false dichotomy. Separating out the technical and the artistic in practice is the first layer. We want our health professionals to be able to engage well with scientific knowledge and also social relations and systems-based practice. So how do we do this? What's missing? We do actually pretty well. We have great people in our system who do research and practice to help people learn the scientific knowledge and apply that and transfer that well. But what's missing or needed is this sort of constant curiosity, a desire and capacity to continually question, to question thoughtfully, to question in order to learn and understand, knowing that there's actually no endpoint for questioning. There's no singular generalizable right answer to be found for some of those messy zones of practice. And when we do believe we've found the single right answer, we can actually cease to be curious and exacerbate the problems that we aim to solve. So this is where critical reflection comes in, and it's about learning to see the lens through which we see our everyday practice. And to explain critical reflection, I'm just going to back up a touch. So first, reflection. Active, persistent, careful consideration of any belief or supposed form of knowledge in light of the grounds that support it and further conclusions to which it tends. This is a really commonly cited definition of reflection, but I still like to share it every time I present because I think we tend to fall into a trap of thinking of reflection as only self-reflection, thinking about your own experience, your own perceptions, your own emotions. But when I talk about reflection, I'm really talking about that careful consideration of knowledge claims. Where did this knowledge come from? Who does it serve? Should I believe it? Are there other forms of knowledge that could inform what I'm doing? Reflective practice, then, is when professionals create new knowledge in and through practice, particularly in those indeterminate zones of practice, the uncertain, the unique, the value conflicted. And in those zones of practice, we need reflective practice and professional artistry to complement that technical rationality. Reflective practice is dynamic and ongoing, so it's not just writing something down after the fact. It's this lens. It's a constant way of being and seeing. It's how we see our everyday experiences and practice. We do it before we practice, while we practice, and after we practice. And here's a quote from Shinn that explains it nicely. The practitioner allows themselves to experience surprise, puzzlement, or confusion in a situation they find uncertain or unique. They reflect on the phenomenon before them and on the prior understandings which have been implicit in their behavior. They carry out an experiment which serves to generate both a new understanding of the phenomenon and a change in the situation. So as I had said, critical reflection is learning to see the lens. So if reflective practice is a way of seeing and being, critical reflection adds a critical lens through which you see and act. So critical reflection is a process of examining assumptions like individual and societal beliefs and values, power relations, and how these assumptions and relations shape practice. It's related to reflexivity, but separate from it. I won't get into those nuanced differences today, but I'll define reflexivity for now as a process of recognizing one's own position in the world in order both to better understand the limitations of one's own knowing and to better appreciate the social realities of others. I'm going to keep saying critical reflection for the rest of this presentation, but I actually mean both of these things. And critically reflective practice has been shown to enable practitioners to excel in these forever uncertain social and structural and systemic dimensions of care. It helps us get to know the other, which can lead to empathy. It helps us advocate, communicate, and collaborate well. It helps us navigate systemic gaps, notice and address inequities, and provide compassionate care, even in the face of systems constraints. So critical reflection helps us achieve a more just world. But currently, critical reflection is learned mostly on the job and through personal experience and relationships. So a study by our colleagues locally, Rowland and Cooper, showed that physicians gained a reflexivity when they were ill and hospitalized, which enabled them to provide more compassionate care in the future. But surely we don't want to leave the teaching of critical reflection or the learning of critical reflection to chance, to personal connections and experiences, or have to hospitalize people in order for them to learn this important capability. And luckily, there is an approach to teach for critical reflection. We can do it through critical pedagogy. Critical pedagogy has been advanced by scholars like Bell Hooks and Paulo Freire, and I've argued that it requires the foundation of epistemology of practice, meaning that we need to value personal knowledge and stories. We need to strive for dialogue and inspire creativity rather than accidentally suppress it while we're trying so hard to promote the also important technical, rational, evidence-based practice, scientific knowledge. We need to still give space for people to bring themselves and their experiences and their creativity when it's appropriate and needed. We also need critical social inquiry, this disruption of dominant assumptions, deconstructing of social constructs, and understanding of social relations. All of this needs to be done while dismantling traditional power structures, like the teacher versus the learner, the clinician versus the patient. So this can all feel a little bit abstract. And in fact, there are many practical examples of how to teach for critical reflection, both in everyday practical workplace-based environments, as well as in the classroom. So right now, we're actually going to run through an example. So when you look at this photo, a really popular ad that's been used by Sick Kids, I invite you to enter into the chat box what stands out for you about this ad at first glance. What do you see? Just type what you see. No wrong answers here. Power, height of the person, versus debris to overcome, precarious, destruction, verses in neon lights, girl liberated, defiance, attitude, oppressive background, youth a winner. Oh my goodness. I will admit I've never done this with 200 people. It's always been a smaller group. Ableism, able-bodied. Okay, I'll pause you there. Joanne, is there any other major theme in your super fast qualitative analysis that you could point out for us?
Garbage.
Garbage.
A need for recycling. Chaos. Drama. Lots of words here.
Courage. Okay.
Yeah.
And so that's what people are seeing, a lot of different things. And I'll pause you on answering that question and shift you to a different question. So when you look at this ad, Who does it help? Thanks, Walter, for the comic relief. So who does this advertisement help? Marketers, someone who is sick. Not sure. Sick kids. Sick kids, the hospital, I assume, but also maybe sick kids as in sick children. Okay. Sick kids, the hospital. And who do these foundation fundraisers, the child on top? Okay, so I'll pause you there. Now, who do all these concepts that you've been sharing, who do they harm? Anyone in a wheelchair, people who are unwell. I don't think it harms, it's about awareness. Those we don't see, people who are disabled, those who can't stand without assistive devices, those living with disabilities, those who don't get better. Okay. So I will pause you all there. Thank you so much for sharing that. And so ideally, this would be done in a small group. And in that small group, normally, when I've used it, for example, it's been with health professions learners of diverse backgrounds, physiotherapy students, med students, sometimes it's faculty. And usually at first glance, I mean, off the bat here, we had a lot of critical reflection. We had people saying maybe there's ableism portrayed in this ad. Usually people just describe descriptively what's going on here. And then using some theory, we question and we push people to see what language, concepts, or ideas about things like disability, illness, or care are reinforced or promoted. Who do these concepts help and harm? So they might help professions feel like they have a role in helping people, but they might harm some children who, for example, might have cerebral palsy and might use assistive devices in their everyday lives. They might also harm some professional trainees who think that their job is to help people overcome as opposed to other goals of care. And they might feel they've failed if they don't help people overcome. And there are many other ways that this image both creates and reproduces messages, and then in relation to those messages, practices that can both help and harm. And we usually end this type of a session, which can take quite a while. People can get into some pretty rich conversation over this. We usually end with something more imaginative. So how else could these concepts be thought about? So concepts like disability and rehabilitation. How else could we imagine those concepts? And this starts to show learners that the way we talk about these taken for granted everyday assumptions and concepts and constructs, it doesn't have to be that way. It was created that way for a reason. It serves a purpose, but it also can have harms if we don't examine it critically. And so we start to think of other ways forward, other ways of thinking, talking, other language-based systems of meaning that we could use. So I'll just move on now, but I wanted to share that as one quick example, and I will give credit where it's due. This particular example of a teaching approach that could be used mostly in a classroom setting, it comes from considerable theory and research. So it's the work of many theorists. Some of those questions that I posed are Foucauldian. It also comes from critical pedagogues and education scholars across the world, but also locally here. So I just want to credit people like Lindsay Baker, Arno Kumagai, Shannon Phelan, Stephanie Nixon, Ayelet Cooper, and many, many others from whom I've learned and collaborated in designing theory-informed, critical reflection enhancing pedagogical approaches. So I said earlier that there are two layers that I wanted to tackle in this session today. And the first layer was that technical rationality versus professional artistry in professional practice, and how that's a false dilemma or divide. The second false dilemma or divide is this rigor versus relevance in research. So while what I just shared with you is informed by much theory, much research, I kept facing this question, but does it work? But does teaching for critical reflection work? And if we were in a smaller classroom setting where I could see your faces, I could see who was here more easily, I would name the people who asked this question, because it really came about in a lot of friendly yet really dynamic debate in things like journal clubs. So someone's just telling me part of the slide is chopped off at the edges. 1 second. Is that any better for people? Okay, looking better. Thank you. Thank you, Nancy. And so this question of, does it work? Does teaching for critical reflection work? I think it echoes that technical rationality versus professional artistry false dichotomy or debate. And this question came from experimentalists in our field who said, well, if it works, then you must be able to prove it. And the prove it meant prove it in ways different than the theory and the qualitative research that you're sharing. And so after much resistance, I did finally cave, or so it felt like caving at the time. I distinctly remember a journal club with a number of people from our community where they said, there must be a way to experimentally prove it works if it works. So I did cave, even though in 2015, I wrote this sentence. The philosophical roots of reflection suggest it's fundamentally meant to exist in indeterminate spaces and not be subject to quantifying measures. But I did what I felt was caving. And we'll get back to that later and see if it really was caving. So collaboratively, with some of the people who were posing that question of, does it work? We asked, does a critical pedagogy session impact what learners talk about and how they talk about it in a subsequent learning experience? We used learners' talk as a proxy for their lens or their way of seeing. And what they talked about was the content or the topics, and how they talked about it was either critically reflective or not. Our participants came from a number of different health professions programs. They were grouped together to learn as interprofessional groups of 5. So it was always a mix of MD and nursing, OTPT, SLP, social work, or other students. And we had control participants and intervention participants. The common learning that all people experienced, whether they were in our control or intervention condition, was a standard social determinants of health online module. And then where the control and intervention groups differed was that the control group got a follow-up social determinants reflective discussion, while the intervention group received a critically reflective dialogue session, which included kind of a mix of what we just did with that Sick Kids ad, as well as some critically reflective explorations of cases. And those were all set in the context of pediatrics and school-based healthcare. Then our outcome measure was to have everybody, control and intervention participants, go through an interactive home care curriculum followed by a debrief. And importantly, the context here was not pediatric, it was older adult home care. So the context differed. And during these interactive discussions and debriefs, we recorded what was said as our outcome measure. They did it immediately following, and then also a week later after the intervention or control experience. How we analyzed the data was interesting in that we started out qualitatively. We created meaning units of all the transcripts where we coded every unique utterance for a what code as well as a how code. The what was based on a coding framework and the how was a binary. It was either critically reflective or not, based on the definitions from this paper that I shared with you earlier. Then we analyzed things quantitatively. So we modeled the predictive probabilities of what was said with a Bayesian hierarchical multinomial regression model. And we modeled predictive probabilities of how codes with a Bayesian hierarchical binary logistic regression model. These models represented the way the data were coded, as I just noted. Now, to accelerate this process, I'm just going to show you one panel of a figure that's most relevant. So we were really most interested in how people talked during the debrief, our outcome measure where they were debriefing about that home care curriculum. You can see here that participants who experienced our intervention, the critically reflective session, were more likely than participants who experienced the control, the social determinants discussion, to talk in ways that were defined as critically reflective. So it worked. Now we had the proof that the experimentalist collaborators had pushed me to pursue. We have the proof that teaching for critical reflection does what it says it does. It can change people's lens, their way of seeing and being, as represented by the proxy of talk. So this is where we'll switch gears a bit. So that's the study. But what's the point? The point is that in this interdisciplinary field of health professions education, paradigmatic diversity offers us challenges and opportunities. We sought as an interdisciplinary team of researchers to reconcile a difference that had caused us much collegial debate. And interestingly, I think that our approach mirrored that of critical reflection. We were bringing together different lenses. We were engaging in creating a bridge, just like critical reflection wants us to do. And so experimentalists had been arguing that claims about teaching for critical reflection were undersubstantiated given a paucity of experimental evidence. And the critical pedagogues on our team argued that such forms of evidence would relegate authentic, embodied reflective capabilities into inauthentic and overly prescriptive caricatures. I've argued this myself, that in measuring reflective activities, we actually change them. We change that reflection in action, kind of natural everyday process into something that seems prescriptive and performative. And that's why I resisted doing this experiment in the first place. However, through our interdisciplinary debate and dialogue, our team developed a novel approach to advancing knowledge on the testing of critical reflection, or teaching of critical reflection and testing if it worked, that satisfied both perspectives. It didn't seem to actually distort critical reflection the way that we were able to design this study and determine whether or not it worked. So this study demonstrates the coalescence of two disparate traditions in education through dialogue and curiosity, which are so crucial to critical pedagogy and critical reflection approaches themselves. Our team built the bridge that critical pedagogy aims to build. And what the field does with this bridge remains to be seen. My hope is that it won't leap forward toward implementing overly simplistic solutions, because these overly simplistic solutions inevitably take on narrow and singular lenses rather than engaging in this continued curiosity, dialogue, and constant questioning. We need to remember that all perspectives are lenses, that all lenses alter, they filter, they shape what is seen. And it's possible that by bridging these false dilemmas of technical and artistic and rigor and relevance, we can actually, again, achieve the goals of critical pedagogy and critical reflection. We can see both ways, and we can do better if we arrive at this new understanding together. So perhaps those dilemmas, those age-old dilemmas of rigor versus relevance, can be resolved by critical reflection itself. And I think that our study team achieved this kind of by accident as we engaged in that debate and then that exploration together. And I want to just sort of leave a lot of time for discussion today, but also end with a quote by Brookfield, or not a quote, but a paraphrase of Stephen Brookfield, who talks about how we really need to ensure that those of us doing critical things, like teaching for critical reflection, don't think that we have found the solution. We need to apply that same healthy skepticism that critical reflection teaches us to have, to realize that we're all seeing through a lens at all times. And it's about understanding that and trying to understand each other's lenses. And if we start to think that we have the best lens, then we end up recreating the problem. So we need to always maintain that healthy skepticism, that critical lens on ourselves as much as we apply it to the outside world. I want to thank our team, and I'm going to name everybody because, again, I think that that really was the main achievement of this work and the study which culminated in an experiment after years of qualitative research and theory-based research. It's this interdisciplinary team that made this possible and that I think models that paradigmatic mixing that I'm talking about. And so that's Jeff Creckley, Ryan Bridges, Victoria Boyd, Adam Gavarkovs, Amelia Kankasjarvi, Sarah Wright, Mahan Kulasegaram, Farah Friesen, Nicole Woods, and special acknowledgements to Lindsay Baker, Alia Karim, Maria Malopoulos, Lori Nimoy, Nida Shahid, Sabrina Tellis, and Paula Veno. Thank you very much. We have a lot of time for discussion, which is exactly what I hoped for. So please feel free to do Q&A or chat. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stella, for a fantastic talk. I'm just pleased, we welcome your questions in the Q&A, and we'll just give you a minute or two to warm up with your questions. Okay, Stella, we have our first question. This is fascinating work. Thank you. Wondering about the talk and the importance of setting psychological safety to allow for creative and open discussion. Did you find anything along these lines?
So thank you for this question. This brings up one of the main tensions in bringing together critical reflection and critical pedagogy, which inherently exist in a paradigm that is different than the experimentalist approach we then employed to study it. When I was writing up the paper and starting to disseminate the work, I found that the culture of presenting experimental work doesn't give a lot of space to elaborate on what that actual critical reflection teaching session looked like. And yet it's about so much more than just doing the thing. Like we just gave an example of using the Sick Kids ad to stimulate some critically reflective dialogue amongst learners. But it's so much more than what we just did. What we built out, because we really wanted to ensure that we did this as best we could in order for the experiment to be teaching for critical reflection well, not just teaching for critical reflection in some kind of checklist manner. We set everything up carefully. So we chose the room and the seating arrangement carefully. And space is hugely important to creating the right kind of learning environment, whether you're aiming for psychological safety or other things as well. So we had a small group, 5 learners and a facilitator. They were seated in a sort of circular arrangement. There was a screen so they could look at some images and prompts, but the screen was just a TV screen, again, in this small room. The lighting was comfortable. There was pizza, and all these conditions were the same for the critical reflection intervention, as well as for the social determinants of health control group discussion. But setting that scene, that space, was important to create a space in which you could have a conversation and have dialogue and have open discussion. In addition, the facilitators were really carefully, I don't want to say trained, but we worked with our facilitators really carefully to ensure that they understood that this was not a discussion with right and wrong answers, that this was an open dialogue, and that we were trying to push people out of their comfort zones, out of their usual ways of seeing. We were trying to help them see through other lenses. And that was all set up very, very carefully. And in the context of this study, there was, I think importantly, no assessment. There was no formal assessment, and the facilitators were not people in really obvious positions of power. So balancing out that teacher-learner power dynamic was a little bit easier in this context than it might be in some sort of professor-student types of contexts. So yeah, all of that is important and part of it. And at the beginning of the talk, when I said for critical pedagogy to occur, yes, we need to teach that critical social inquiry, the deconstruction, the challenging of discourses, but we also need to create an epistemology of practice. And to me, that's fundamental. We need to make space for people to bring forward their personal knowledge, their experiential knowledge, their creativity. And again, much of health professions education structurally can suppress those things, sometimes by accident, sometimes on purpose. So we were very careful to invite that type of knowledge and create a space where that was possible. And I think that's crucial. But again, one of the challenges in doing this paradigmatically mixed work was I do think that gets silenced a little bit in the dissemination process. So thanks for asking that and letting me go on about it.
Okay, I'm happy you left lots of time for questions, Stella, because we have a bunch coming in. And I just want to make a note. I see the comments in the chat and Q&A, and I will get to both. But if you can stick to the Q&A, that might just make it a bit easier. But just to follow up on that question, I'll just fill this one out because do you have any tools that you recommend for critical reflection with student trainees or activities that you can recommend? So just, I'm not sure there's anything extra you want to add to what you were just talking about.
Tools that we could recommend. So after doing that Sick Kids example, I mentioned that it was informed by the work of a lot of local people. So there's a paper by Stephanie Nixon, Barb Gibson, Ethan Young. I yell at Cooper, I'm going to forget names, but it's the 7 steps framework paper. And it has a really nice summary of how you can use this approach in your own teaching environment. It comes with some cautions within the paper that I want to mention here, because I think often we're all busy and it can be easy to use 7 steps, but to keep in mind that the caution is within the context of the study I just shared, as well as that 7 steps framework. It's not enough. And whenever anything is kind of packaged up that neatly, we do run the risk of making something that is dynamic and complex and nuanced and social into something that could be misapplied as a sort of checklist, simplistic approach. And then we lose some of the effect. So I think have a look at that 7 steps framework, but mind the cautions within the article. And there's also teachingfortransformation.com that Lindsay Baker, Farah Friesen, myself, and others have contributed to, which shares many different examples that can be used. There's a lot of the names that I cited throughout the presentation are people who have written really theory heavy as well as very practical papers that share ideas. And then the last thing I would recommend is, it's not a tool, but I would really recommend reading Bell Hook's Teaching to Transgress, because I think it really helps give the sense of what we're going for in this type of education.
Thanks, Stella. So the next question, if the goal of critical reflection is to move towards justice, how can we move from critical reflexivity and reflection towards actual action and praxis? On a related note, how we can ensure that critical reflexivity isn't constrained by currently acceptable paradigms and discourses, i.e. EDI as opposed to Black liberation.
Okay, so what was the first part of the question was moving to action and praxis, right? And this is, I'm so glad that someone asked this, because in one of the studies that I really briefly cited earlier, it's the one Maria Milopoulos is second author, Shannon Phelan is last. We published it in 2020. In that study, we found, within definitions of critical reflection, there's this assumption of action. The whole point of it, as you've said, is to act, to make the world more just. And yet in that study, most of our participants, it was a qualitative study, seemed to stop at noticing inequity, sometimes noticing problems, injustices, and wanting to enact change, and then maybe sometimes enacting workarounds. And these workarounds would help a particular patient in front of them, even though the system might be broken, the system might be unjust, but the clinician could come up with a creative solution for the person in front of them to get that person what they needed. And there's been much debate and critique about that level of advocacy, because the question is that advocacy and change and action? Perhaps yes, but does it also then perpetuate and permit the problems of the larger system? And it's interesting because many definitions of critical reflection and praxis focus on action as the goal, but a lot of empirical work shows that, at least in our context, the goal is often the noticing, the desiring, and then the enacting of workarounds. So I think that more work needs to be done there, both practically and theoretically, because I would actually push back against some of the critiques. And a doctoral student I'm so lucky to work with, Victoria Boyd, is working on this right now. There is also emerging work that says that micro level, on the ground, grassroots action that seems like it's small scale action is very, very important and needed to push those larger changes in systems, in policies, in structures. So part of it is that by becoming critically reflective, you change your lens, and then, as our study showed, you change your talk, and that changed talk is changed action at times. Our future work and Victoria Boyd's doctoral work is actually looking at the action. So looking at the things that people do, like creating written reports and written letters for patients, to see if our teaching approaches change those very tangible actions, like the writing of a report or letter for a patient. I think that we all have our own anecdotal and experiential evidence of these kinds of shifts, but that's our next step in our research as well. And then I can't remember, the second part of the question was really important around.
How can we ensure that critical reflexivity isn't constrained by currently acceptable paradigms and discourses, i.e. EDI as opposed to Black liberation?
Yeah, that is a really, really good question. I don't think I'm the best person to answer it. I think that acknowledging that what we're doing is within a system that does constrain us is part of it, and then actively trying to shift the system is hugely important. And that again can happen at a micro level. Like there's a course I teach where every year my grades get pushed back because I try to create that safe space to be able to do this kind of learning. And so students end up with a higher grade, and I have to write to the chair to explain my paradigm of education and why that grade has to be higher in order for that kind of learning to happen. So that's one example of that pushback. But specifically in response to that question, I would invite anybody to respond. I mean, even this right here is kind of a structure and a paradigm that isn't completely conducive to the kinds of learning that I usually aim to foster. So Joanne and I practiced earlier. We know we can enable people to talk. So people in the audience, we can press a button and then your voice can be heard. So if anyone wants to respond to that question who's more qualified and able than I, please go ahead. But thank you for the question.
Okay, I don't see a hand up. So the next question, I wonder if there is an outcome in the larger world of healthcare besides or in addition to helping learners develop a more critically reflective mindset. It seems that outcome is the wrong word based on your definition, but I guess it's back to the big why.
Could you, Joanne, paste that question in the chat for me? Okay. An outcome in the larger world of healthcare. Yeah. And I know it's hard to use language that feels right, but I think, change is one, action is another. So are there actions and changes in the larger world of healthcare beyond this way of seeing, beyond the lens, I guess, beyond the mindset that we could achieve? I think that there are many, and I think that what this study enables by bringing together the experimentalists and the critical pedagogues, I think we've created a sort of proof of concept that could be used to look at these other actions, changes, or outcomes in the larger world of healthcare. So one study that we're going to do is going to look at, for example, chart notes. And the reason that we're going to look at chart notes to see if we can change what's charted is because we've seen evidence of how people are written about in their charts reflects things like unconscious bias, stigma, all kinds of forms of injustice and oppression. And so we're starting to look at how people are charted as a material representation of how they are seen. I think that there are many other examples of this that we could explore now that we have this proof of concept. So how people are talked to. It doesn't have to just be how people are talked about, as in our study. It could also be looking at the conversations between practitioners and clients, or patients and doctors. And then, I think it's about kind of connecting the links from our impacts on faculty. So if we're doing faculty development, can we shift what faculty say and do and how they teach, and we can study that. And then if faculty are shifting what they're doing, does that have impacts on the learners that they work with? And then if that shifts, does that have impact on the patient experience, the care experience?
Okay, the next question. Do you equate reflection in action to critical reflection? If not, how do you differentiate between the two?
So I don't equate them. Reflection in action is really about this ability to notice in the moment. And it was kind of Donald Shun's attempt to really emphasize that knowledge is in our doing. It's not just this separate thing out there in a book that you learn. And then once you've learned it, it's in your mind and then you can enact it. But knowledge is also both created and demonstrated and adjusted in your doing, in your everyday work. And so it's like normally if I could see everybody and I was doing this beeper session, I could look at your body language, look at your expressions, and I could adjust what I'm doing on the fly. It doesn't necessarily need to be critical for it to be reflection in action. And so I see reflection as that questioning of knowledge claims, reflective practice as questioning those knowledge claims before, during, and after practice or doing. And then critical reflection adds the lens through which we're constantly being reflective. And so that lens is one that attends to assumptions and power relations continually. And you could also put a different qualifier before reflection, which many have done with self-reflection. So a lot of people focus in health professions education on self-reflection. For me, critical reflection is a modifier of reflection. It puts a focal point on assumptions, power, structure, systemic issues.
Okay, so Stella, the next question, it was originally in the chat, and thank you for putting it into the question and answer. So you could actually read along if you want to. It is a bit longer, but I'll read it out. In describing critical reflection and critical pedagogy, you use the phrase to dismantle. That seems to imply a deconstruction, a tearing apart, or a tearing down. At the same time, you suggest that it can build a bridge. Are these two movements possibly in tension or even at odds with each other? In the context of doing away with learners and teachers, how does one build a bridge between these two communities?
I love this question. And if you're willing to come on the air with us, I would love to have a conversation about that. So I will acknowledge for all those who are knowledgeable about the theory around these things that I was being very casual in my mixing of concepts and terms, even though in some of my published work, I've been very particular. For example, one of the papers that I wrote with Ayala Cooper and Sarah Wright was about distinguishing very carefully critical reflection from critical reflexivity, which many would argue for all intents and purposes in our practices of HPE are interchangeable. But we wanted to carefully separate them because they do have subtle differences historically and theoretically, which imply different practical applications as well. But today I was kind of just using all of these similar concepts and words interchangeably in order for us to be able to have a more practical level discussion. So I think that the idea of dismantling is about dismantling our adherence to traditional power structures where there would be, like this, the teacher at the front of the room talking to a room full of passive learners or recipients, which may be a bit of a caricature, but also can ring true for some of us in some of our past educational experiences where there's that sort of sage on the stage and everyone else is just listening and receiving. And so, Paulo Freire really critiqued this banking model of education and talks about education as needing us to move away from that. And so it's not necessarily about doing away with teachers and learners. It's more that anyone can be a teacher or a learner depending on the moment and depending on the context. It's not a static, like you are the teacher in this room always, and you are the learner in this room always. But there may be moments where the teacher is learning and is the learner, and the learner is teaching and is the teacher. So that's how I see that as bridging, as opposed to, I'm not dismantling the roles and actions of teaching and learning, but suggesting we dismantle our traditional adherence to that power structure in a static manner.
Okay. In response to your invitation to come on the air, the response was, sorry, would love to come on the air, but I'm having technical issues. Okay. We have 8 minutes left. There's a couple of sort of comments here, and there's one person with a hand up, and there's one other question. So maybe one person actually asked for references for critical reflection. So is there an opportunity to follow up afterwards for you to share references with people who are interested?
Yes, absolutely. You can email me. And if you go to teachingfortransformation.com, there's actually a resource list that has a lot of references there.
Okay, I'm going to read out a comment here, and then I will get to the last question and then the person with the hand up. When we ask learners to develop a more critically reflective mindset, we need to be mindful of cultural context and personal circumstance. The notion of questioning is perhaps a very Western concept. We also need to look at how academics are taught in public schools. Developing that mindset needs to start early.
I completely agree.
Okay, so just being conscious of the time, I'll just ask this one last question that's in the Q&A, and then we'll go to the person with the hands up. So Stella, if you could just be conscious of the few minutes we have left. So the question here is, when we ask learners to develop a more critically reflective, as a follow-up to making space and setting up the right environment, is there a way in which to create that space in a clinical setting? Is there a way to practice this at the time that a critical event occurs? For example, if a comment is made in the process of patient care that requires inquiry and reflection.
Absolutely. This is such an important question. And maybe at some point we could do a follow-up deeper with a panel, because I wish I could invite people like Arno Kumagai, Lisa Richardson, Lindsay Baker to join, because I know they've all done a lot of important work in this area. So one thing that comes up time and time again in our research anyway is that learners can see what their faculty or their preceptors are doing, and they recognize when it's critically reflective or not. And they talk about this, they notice this. And so a lot of it is in the role modeling, but it can go both ways. There was a study by Sarah Wright and colleagues that showed learners can also see, what they don't want to ever reenact and do, when other clinicians do it. And so that can help them learn. In terms of actively pointing things out in everyday clinical teaching, it certainly depends on the environment, the clinical teaching environment. There are some contexts that perhaps don't allow for that time, but at the same time, it is really in that overall approach. So it's not always going to take more time to stop and point things out. It can be demonstrated in the doing. And so I think a huge part of this is faculty development. If we can shift how our teachers are engaging in their everyday practice and their role modeling, again, it's critical reflection and critically reflective practice. It doesn't always require the stop and think and step back like we did with the Sick Kids Act. It can be in your everyday doing. And in some of the past studies, we were looking at what people were doing, like just not talking about, but what they were actually doing in their everyday practice. And you can see it in people's practice. So you can have that critical reflection in action that the learners can then observe and emulate, as well as the pointing it out explicitly in the contexts where that is possible and time allows. And I think Lindsay Baker, Lindsay Herzog, Lisa Richardson, Amelia Congas-Jarvie, they've all, we've done a study looking at how trans care has been provided in family health units locally, and they've got some really rich descriptions and data of clinicians modeling this type of teaching every day. So yeah, I'll leave it there.
Okay, Stella, I have Walter Himnell. I'm going to let you, I just lost it to do that. Oh, allow to talk. Okay. Walter, I saw your hand is up. Would you like to ask a question? And
it may have been by accident, Joanne.
okay. Okay. Okay, then in that case, we're actually perfect timing. I think we've hit all the questions. Lots of thank you, Stella. So thank you, Stella, for a fantastic talk and also for leaving so much time for discussion. And thank you everyone for your very rich and thoughtful questions. And the next beeper, before we sign off, I want to share with you will be held on April 27th with Alison Crawford, presenting on understanding digital compassion through story, implications for virtual care education. So hopefully we will see you all then for that session.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.